Hey, so a week ago we introduced Isaiah and we barely put our toes in the water in terms of getting into the text. Today we're going to jump into the text. I don't know how far we'll go because I realize the more I've looked at this and started making notes, there's so much here. One commentator has stated that Isaiah has more biblical theology in the book than any other book. Part of that's because of the length, but what he's getting at is it's really far ranging. And in fact, in Arnold Fruchtenbaum's commentary, he itemizes a very lengthy list of all the different areas of theology that get touched on. It really is like that. Um, but what we want to keep in mind is we jump into this book, people don't study it for a couple of reasons. One, um, it preaches to us, and sometimes it isn't all that nice to hear it. Two, the book is long. When you study something that's fairly short, like I've been going through the book of Psalms in my uh, Sunday school class at church, we're dealing with a single psalm on a given Sunday. Most of the ones I select are fairly brief. No one is going through that psalm and loses sight of the overall organization and the purpose of that psalm because you're dealing with some material that's 1 or 2 pages in our Bible. But when we deal with longer books, as we've done some studies, Ezekiel, Job, Hebrews, it's easy to get lost somewhere. And you have lots of very hyper-technical commentaries that have their uses. They deep dive a lot of the words. It's helpful. But sometimes some of the most valuable ways to think about this book is to keep sight of the bigger organization. So I'm going to come back to that a lot. I always try to do that with the other books because I'm thinking that the key to really understanding the book in a good practical way and being able to live it is not losing sight of its organization. And I'll mention a little about that here before we get into chapters 1 and 2. It's a fascinating question, at least to me, as to why chapter 1 is chapter 1 and chapter 6 is chapter 6. If you've read ahead, Isaiah gets called as a prophet in chapter 6. So why on God's green earth is chapter 6 not chapter 1? Why did God not start at the beginning of his ministry with his calling? Why does he put it in chapter 6? And we'll spend more time thinking about that when we get there, but it bears noting this book is highly organized and it's highly unified, even though a lot of modern commentators say the opposite of both of those things. We'll see that organization. And putting chapter 6 where it's at, putting the calling of Isaiah after the first 5 chapters is very intentional, very purposeful. The first 5 chapters are the rest of the book sort of summarized in a way. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but it's something of a microcosm of the rest of the book. Much of the theology of the rest of the book is introduced in these first 5 chapters. They serve as a prologue in that way. And then there's his calling, which has like I say, a distinct purpose for being where it's at. But when you get after chapter 6, and if we summarize the first 6 chapters, there's a multitude of issues that will come up later in the book, but it really gets to this idea of being a faithful servant of God. And Isaiah is exactly that. Chapter 6 presents him as a great example of that, but the nation has not been a faithful servant of God. But when you get past chapter 6 and you get to that big unit from chapter 7 to chapter 39, you can subdivide it several ways. But trusting God is the basis for being a faithful servant, right? If trust and faith are related ideas, and even the notion of faith in the New Testament can have that connotation or that aspect of trusting, not doing, not working, but trusting. And you've got to trust God. And it's fascinating that unit 7 to 39 will open up with material about Ahaz, King Ahaz. And it will close, those first few chapters will open with Ahaz. It will close at the end of that unit through chapter 39 with Hezekiah, his son. Ahaz is the very picture of a king who was not a trusting servant of God. He was a bad king and he did not trust God at all. Although he liked to pretend he did, I suspect he went to church every Sunday, but had no trust of God during the week. Hezekiah, and most of you are probably familiar with the story and how God does a miraculous rescue of Jerusalem. Hezekiah is the very picture of faith. Now, he has a bad ending after God gives him 15 more years. He becomes prideful. But he was, for the most part, given a good score in the Bible, and he's the picture of faith. So the big unit from 7 to 39 opens with no trust in a King Ahaz, closes with a trusting God in King Hezekiah. And between those bookends, it's highly organized. Between the bookends, he will talk about all the things that Israel has put its trust in but shouldn't. Things it puts its trust in other than God. And we'll see those things in these first couple of chapters. So it's highly organized. And then as you get past chapter 39, it will deal with the matter of grace as a motivation for service. Sounds like a New Testament concept, but it's here. That's chapters 40 to 55, and then 56 through the end of the book will deal with righteousness and the character of servanthood. And of course, in those latter chapters, after chapter 40, we will see a lot of revelation about the Messiah, but there'll be stuff before that as well. So we'll keep coming back to organization and thinking about that. But if you view Isaiah 1 to 5 as a prologue with a bit of a climax with his calling to ministry, that will help you sort of get a handle on the book. One other caution about the book that I think bothers folks or causes confusion. Isaiah jumps from today, speaking to today, to talking about tomorrow, then back to talking about today. And he just moves back and forth when he wants to. Sometimes he jumps from talking about today to talking about the latter days or the last days, a particularly prophetic eschatological phrase. And then he jumps back into today. And typically, when he's talking about today, this guy could not work in any church probably in the United States because he would get fired. The congregation would vote him out the first Sunday. And I'll show you why in a minute. Uh, but when he talks about the latter days, there's a lot of blessing. There's a lot of look what God's going to do. Look how great Israel's going to be. And just about the moment you're just saying, wow, this is so awesome. Then he jumps back to today and pulls you back into today's reality and says, but here's what's happening today. And I kid you not, I think if this book had been written to the United States, it would almost read the same. Okay, we're not Israel, but it would almost read the same. When he is indicting Israel in chapter 1, I mean, it's hard not to see how not only the United States, but certainly the United States is guilty of so much of the things that Israel did, and it's only pride that would tell us that a different result will happen, that God will treat us differently than his chosen nation when we do the very things that caused God to bring in the Assyrians and bring judgment on the northern kingdom and later used the Assyrians to judge the southern kingdom, although they didn't ultimately take Jerusalem, they take everything else. He did that to his chosen nation. What will he do to the Gentile nations who do the same thing? Well, he's going to answer that question when we get past chapter 6. Any questions before we jump in? Just thoughts or comments so far? Anybody? Okay. Well, I'll take little bite-sized chunks and back up and see if there's some thoughts or questions here. We covered a few verses last time, but I just want to start right there at the beginning in verse 2. Uh, Judah is being indicted. Remember, Isaiah is a prophet, primarily the southern kingdom, and um, but he prophesies in the overlap between the time when the northern kingdom is still around and then when it falls in 722 BC. But he's prophesying to Judah, and he's indicting the nation. He's bringing the formal charges in a sense. Uh, and God's the one that's the prosecutor, and God's the one that's the judge. And ultimately, he'll be the one to bring out to bring the judgment. He says in verse 2, listen, heavens, and pay attention, earth, for the Lord has spoken. It's interesting, he calls upon heaven and earth in a sense, as the jurors, as the ones to pay attention to the indictment. This is a common expression, particularly in the book of Deuteronomy. I'm not going to go read all of those, but there's a number of places in the Deuteronomy that says essentially the same thing. God calls upon heaven and earth to witness what's being said. It's a common thing. I think it may have to do, at least in part, with the fact that while heaven and earth will eventually end, and there'll be a new heavens and new earth, heaven and earth, as we observe it right now, is it outlasts the lives of most people. There will be eventually a generation that will see it replaced, but in general, um, time is going to progress. These people are going to come and go, but heaven and earth will, sort of serve as the proverbial witnesses to the indictment. I have raised children, this translation says children. It really is sons. I've raised sons. And your translation may say sons in verse 2. You say, why does it matter? Children conveys a similar idea, but there is something particular about sons. You see references to the sons of God, the daughters, um, but not the Son of God to refer to mere human beings. So there's often sons of God, children of God in that sense. But when Jesus says, I am the Son, not a son, but the Son of God, the Jews understood exactly what he was saying, say John chapter 5, and that's why they tried to stone him. So to just understand that, it's a common Old Testament expression of God's children, but it's often cast in terms of sons, and that's what it is here. I've raised sons, I've raised children, and I've nourished them, I've brought them up. This brought them up is not just like, I did my duty as a parent, got them to 18 years old, sent them on their way. He did more than that. He brought them up to a place of prominence, indeed glory. Think about the kingdom under David, under Solomon. God brought them up to a wonderful position, and they're throwing it all away. And that's the idea. He brought them up, but they've rebelled against me. This is why the book is here. They rebelled against him. And it raises the question, of course, how did they rebel? Well, we're going to look at that because he's going to spell it out. He's fixing to list out 7 different things about them in this indictment. But this is what they've done. They're the rebellious children. And he says, if I were writing this, and thank goodness I'm not, but I would put it sort of in the Texan talk, they have acted like a group of people who are dumber than a sack of rocks. Because, when I come out of the bedroom in the morning, the first person that greets me is my cat because she knows I'm a giver of food. She's figured that out. And she's figured out that without the giver of food, she will starve. That cat is already smarter in a spiritual sense than a lot of people. They don't recognize the hand that feeds them. And that's what God says here. The ox knows its owner, verse 3. Even he intentionally picks an animal that's not really known for doing postdoctoral research. He picks a dumb animal and says even the ox knows its owner. It knows to show some fidelity to its owner. The donkey knows its master's feeding trough. The donkey's smart enough to find where the food bucket's at and has a recognition that there's somebody putting that food there every day so that when it shows up, it gets fed. And he's really saying these dumb animals show more wisdom than the nation of Judah, than God's own people. It's quite an indictment. He says, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. And then he lists seven indictments. I want to read these off and then I will pause a second. He says, and if you look at verse 4, you may notice, I've said before, this is Hebrew poetry. Verse 1 has four lines, at least in modern translations, how they format it. The King James usually doesn't format it that way, but it does have four lines. Verse 2 has four lines. Verse 3 has four lines. Verse 4 has seven. Seven lines, seven indictments, seven charges. And this is a theme a lot of times when God does things that, there'll be sevens or multiples of sevens. We're not getting into numerology. It's just that's a number that's often associated with things God does or says. And look at them like this is the indictment. O sinful nation. That's number one. People weighed down with iniquity or it's not exactly the same word, right? It's a parallelism between sinful nation and people burdened or weighed down with their iniquity. Brood of evildoers. Now think about that word, brood. For one, you might think of John the Baptizer, who also could not have gotten a job in any modern church because he greeted the guest who came out there to the river one day and said, "You brood of vipers, who's warned you, right, of the coming judgment? You brood of vipers, you children of vipers, children of snakes." I thought these were the children of God. He's going to get more insulting than this, but you think about how popular Isaiah is with this message, out preaching to the whichever denomination you want to put there, the good Baptists, the good Presbyterians, the good Assembly of God folks, and he says, "You brood of evildoers, you seed of evildoers." These people would have said what they said in John chapter 8 to Jesus. We have Abraham to our father. We're the seed of Abraham. Look at us. You're a seed of evildoers. Number four, they're depraved children. Depraved. People who ought to think in a godly way, whose heart should represent godliness, righteousness, but they're depraved in the way they think, which is to say, they think the way lost people think. They have abandoned the Lord. Someone might say, as so many wrongly teach now, God's abandoned Israel. No, Israel's abandoned God. And what God's going to make clear is that there is a remnant. He's going to introduce what we call remnant theology here shortly, that he will rescue and bless. But they've abandoned the Lord. God hadn't changed. God's character hasn't changed. His promises haven't changed. And his requirements haven't changed, but they've abandoned the Lord. Number six, they've despised the Holy One of Israel. And number seven, they've turned their backs on him. This doesn't picture God turning away from them, at least until they first turned away from God. They are the ones that begin rejecting, turning away, and becoming essentially hardening their own hearts, as it were, to put it in some language of Romans 9. But long before God hardens them. The Holy One of Israel, I mentioned this last week, that occurs 31 times in the Bible and 25 times are in Isaiah. There's also the phrase like the Holy One of Jacob that will occur once, so you might consider that an additional example in Isaiah. But it occurs 25 times here. One of the theological topics among many dealt with in this book is the holiness of God. And he will be presented as the Holy One of Israel multiple times. We have such a small view of sin, and so do these Israelites, that we think that sin is a small thing, or that we can fix our sin by doing some good stuff that sort of outweighs it. And we lose this idea of God's holiness, right? This idea that he is exalted, that he is transcendent, that he is above the the heavens. He's extreme otherness, cut above, different, immanence. Immanence in the sense that he's present, but at the same time different and a cut above. And this holiness is why there's really not such a thing as a small sin or a little sin that doesn't matter, the way we like to think of it. Um, they've despised. Now think about this. You know, it's easy to look at this book as many do, and they just imagine these are all lost people. I don't think that. One of the things that's so telling by its absence is God actually saying to these people somewhere in this chapter or in chapter 2 that, you know, you're all about to go to hell. You're about to spend eternity apart from me. He never says that. These are believers who actually despise God. And you have to ask yourself, well, is that possible for us to do today? Can we be despisers of God? And the answer is, yep, we can. And we're a lot more comfortable with the idea that real Christians can't do that, but we keep getting confronted with God saying, "Yep, this they did it here, and they did it here, and they did it here." We can do all these terrible things, and there are consequences, as he'll spell out. Let me pause there. That's the indictment, um, and they're going to have to put on a defense here in a moment. We'll see if it holds water. Any thought or comment so far,
If
Cheryl?
if if only real Christians can't
Hmm?
do that, then there's no real Christians.
Well, that's right. Because I think we all, you could pick David as an example. You know, we all have our moments. Sometimes those moments last a very long time. David's dealing with Bathsheba and all that went on for months and months and months. You know, it is possible someone that engages in this kind of behavior was never a believer, but it shouldn't be our automatic assumption, even though it gives us great comfort, maybe, because we also think, and that's kind of the point you're getting to, Dan, we think, but I don't do that. Cheryl?
One of the things I wanted to mention, bear with me for a second because I underlined it in Fruchtenbaum's book.
Hmm.
Um, he basically says that one of the things that proves that Isaiah was written by one man, Isaiah, is because of the consistent use of terminology throughout the book. And one of them was the one that you just mentioned.
Yep.
And also the organization. Basically, it just precludes anything saying that. I'm just trying to find it. And I can't find it. Never can when you want to. Poopadoos. Bu- 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 Okay, here it is. It's also called the Holy One of Israel. This expression is used a total of 31 times in the Hebrew Bible,
Hmm.
besides Isaiah, but Isaiah, it's in Isaiah 139,
It's
1:4, 5:19, 24,
right,
10, all of them. I said this is one of the arguments against the idea that the book was written by two or even three Isaiahs.
right.
So just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. That book, that term unifies the what people think of as the two halves, chapter 1 to 39, which are clearly a distinct unit, and chapter 40 through the end. It's there. But also, like these ideas we're seeing in chapter, we're going to see in chapter 1 and 2, chapter 1 through 5 is showing us things we're going to see through the rest of the book. So it really is highly organized. Susan?
All I want to say is welcome to Western civilization today.
Yeah.
And then I will defer to Judd.
Yeah, you see how I said it earlier, this really um you can preach Isaiah and we probably people who are in the pulpit should be preaching Isaiah
You bet.
today. Judd?
Yes, Exodus, for example, Exodus 14:31 says, "And
Mhm.
when Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses." But in Hebrews, it makes it very clear that they were faithless and unbelieving. So you can definitely have the phenomenon of unbelieving believers, right? They
Yeah.
believe in the Lord and they're justified, right? Phase one of their salvation, they
Yeah.
were successful, but phase two of their salvation, they have not believed in the Lord and they're faithless and they're not walking with the Lord. So, Calvinism just to me, every time I hear this crazy thing that, oh, if you really believe, then, you're going to be consistently doing good works and persevering in the faith. I always wonder, what Bible are they reading?
Mhm. Yeah,
True.
it just makes people uncomfortable, but it's not from a Bible perspective that they come at it. From a philosophical perspective, they're bothered by the idea that some of these people we're reading about in chapter one here are going to spend eternity with God, even though they suffered bad consequences. And what Judge illustrated from Exodus is so key to this book. It's this element of trust. So much of this comes down to what are you trusting in? A foreign nation? Are you trusting in your religious rituals? Because these people were doing it. Are you trusting in your money? Are you trusting in your power, your affluence? These are all the things that Isaiah is going to indict them on, that they trusted in and that aren't going to save them. They're described in verses 5 and 6 in terms of someone who's just had the tar beat out of them and can't connect the theological dots. And that's a problem we often have. We make a grave error if we assume because somebody is going through a trial of life that sin caused that. We know from the book of Job, and frankly, we know from other places like John 9 that there, that other things can be the cause than sin. And we also know from James 1, Romans 5, and 1 Peter 1 that the trials of life is something we all face. God uses them to grow us. But we also make a mistake if we never pause to think that maybe you're going through a trial or someone else is going through a trial because God is taking them to the woodshed. We don't connect the theological dots that my life is in a mess because God told me, here's the way to do this. Here's the way to form a healthy relationship. Here's the way to pick someone that you would marry. Here's the way to worship. And I've chosen to do the exact opposite. My life's in a mess, and I have no clue why. And I'm talking about in the life of a believer. I'm going to church. I'm praying. I don't know why the life's in a mess. God, please fix it. And we don't back up and connect these dots that, you know what? My life's in a mess because I turned my back on God. When God tells you how to do something and you choose to do it the other way, that's what I mean by not trusting God. That's what Isaiah is talking about when he says not trusting God. If you don't trust God, you shouldn't expect God to prop you up. And this person's had the tar beat out of him. Look in verse 5, and he asks these rhetorical questions. He's almost poking at them. Why do you want more beatings? Why do you keep on rebelling? Now remember, he's raised them as children, and certainly children could have discipline, and it might have that kind of language there of discipline. But why would you want another beating? Why would you keep doing the same thing? Now, the way their beatings come is, and this is a place where, Isaiah is not tied down a time marker for us. He's no doubt probably looking forward to some things that will happen, uh, um, you know, in the book by the by, because the Assyrians are going to come in, and the Assyrians are going to give them a beating. But just understand, it's like you're not connecting the dots between the rebellion and the beatings. Cheryl?
Um, and when I read this, and I'm thinking back of them back then, but I'm also thinking of us today. And the bad things that came to Israel didn't come immediately. It kind of took a while for it to unfold, so that there was enough good times, enough prosperity, enough wealth for people to say, "Oh, it's not really that bad. We're okay. We're okay." And I think that's a lot of today too, where
Mm,
people well, look, we're the most powerful nation in the world, and blah 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 blah. And I honestly think we can read it here and we can see and we know what happened to Israel, but they couldn't see it and they
Mhm.
didn't believe it and they didn't know and they were blinded. So again, it's just like the history of mankind. We see what we want to see instead of what really is.
Even though Isaiah came and told them, Isaiah read them the card. He said, "This is what God has to say about you," and that's where, as Christians, we're called to have a renewed mind. We're called to trust God. We're called to trust in His Word, to let it transform how we think so that we do connect theological dots. And we are called not, and it all comes back to trust. And kind of your comment, it gets back to this trust issue. We as a nation are quite accustomed to the idea that we're the superpower, we're the wealthiest nation, and that's true right now. God can change that in a moment. And given the current trajectory we're on, given the big celebration over the last week or so of now we can execute children right up to the moment before birth. Uh, how much longer will God allow this to go on? I don't know. I'm no prophet. All I know is if he dropped the hammer on his chosen nation, he'll drop the hammer on the United States at some point. That's just how it works. And as we read Isaiah, we're going to see a whole bunch of other countries had the hammer dropped on them. Um, trust. Trust is the key here. And we just need to really take that thing to heart and how easy it is. I had someone, I read a counseling book. I read a lot of books, but this, and he was talking about Christian counseling, and he said, you know what it really boils down to most of the time? Listen to someone's story, hear them tell you how they're trying to do life according to sin, and then tell them to stop sinning. Cheryl, did you have your hand up still?
Yes, I did. Well,
Oh,
I
go
know
ahead.
I put back up again. I'm just going to say right out loud, I had a really hard time this week. I really did. In fact, I
Mhm.
called Dart and I was foaming at the mouth when I talked to him, and I was devastated. And I live in New York, so between the absolute awfulness of assisted suicide
Mhm.
and putting people where they have no business being, and then this thing in Massachusetts, I was just like, these people, they're like they're like clapping and welcoming Satan and all his minions. Come on in, and let's party. And I'm
And there,
heartbroken. I'm
I
heartbroken.
I agree with you. It's bad. Um, I'm not looking down on them as a critic, but the fact is, God's word promises, not only in Romans 1, but in a number of other places, and most notably Isaiah, He's going to give them what they've asked for. That's what's going to happen, and they're about to reap it. I don't know how and when. Again, I'm not a prophet, but we can't kid ourselves. Um, and because at the end of the day, it's a pride issue, and in fact, that's going to be a prominent thing here in these first 5 chapters. Judd,
Yeah, it's me.
oh, Winnie, good.
I just
Who
think,
had a birthday, right? Did you have a birthday?
oh yeah, a while ago. And then I mistakenly put my grandson up for having a birthday because I
Mm,
was taking a photo of him.
ah,
Oh, I'm just a mess.
it's hard to keep up with them all.
Oh, I'm a mess. Okay, so things are really insane when I considered Nuremberg. I absolutely loved that movie I just saw, a cheerful movie.
Mm,
And I consider it a cheerful movie because of, and you will know that I am the Lord when I lay my vengeance on you. And the whole verse says, God will not be mocked. God help these people. Like, I mean, I worked through COVID and I have such very strong opinions about the vaccine and everything. And that when I see these people getting crucified over what they did and all the people that died alone and everything else, really am glad that that when I see the judgment, I really do. I think that when people are looking at the essence of God and they are not considering righteousness and judgment, wow, God help them. God help them. And I thank God we have the Bible and that we're studying.
Yeah, yeah. It's the human pride is really that chief sin that runs through the Bible. People don't disbelieve God because there's a lack of evidence. They just want to do things their own way, you know? What's scary here is that God has picked out a nation and he's going to work through that nation not because they're awesome, but despite this behavior. And he's done a lot of that with a lot of other nations in different ways. I mean, the fact of the matter is, God has done extraordinary things through the United States. And in the founding of the country, and the way things were structured, not everybody was a Christian. I'm not saying that, but it did reflect a lot of biblical ideas. And now we're at war with the foundation. And once the foundation cracks, then that's where you got a problem. That's what happened here in Judah. Why do you want more beatings? Why do you keep on rebelling? You can almost, anyone who's raised some kids is thinking about having a similar conversation. Like negative consequences, whatever, it doesn't have to be a beating, but whatever the consequences, that happens when you do this. And yet you keep doing it over and over and over and over. The whole head is hurt. The whole head is injured. You don't get a worse injury than a head injury. And as I said, I think Isaiah is looking forward to something that will happen. The Assyrians will come in and take northern Israel completely. They'll defeat it. They will then go into Judah under a different king named Sennacherib, who's prominent in the scripture, not just in Isaiah, but other places. We know a lot about Sennacherib. When we get to that later, way down the road, we have writings from Sennacherib. We have art about Sennacherib. I will show you those things. But Sennacherib is going to lay waste and burn 46 cities in Judah, everything except Jerusalem. And so you can understand the whole head is hurt. The whole heart is sick. Now the heart is your seat of thinking. It's the seat of, your decision making. And he says it's sick. But he speaks of the country as this like one individual that's had the tar beat out of him. He's got an injured head. The heart is sick. From the sole of the foot even to the head, no spot is uninjured. You can't look at a place on the body of this injured person that's not injured, that doesn't have a wound, a welt, or even a festering sore, according to verse 6. And it's not been cleansed or bandaged or soothed with oil. When I read these two verses, can you think of a New Testament passage that comes to mind? Go ahead, Susan.
Sorry. Yeah. Is this where is the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom? Is that where the idea of the 10 lost tribes comes from?
Yeah, basically, because you had two tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, and then you had the other ones in the north,
Oh,
essentially. But you had that idea. Now
yeah. I know it's not really, they
they're
didn't
not
get
really
lost.
lost, right? They
No.
just they got taken into captivity because the ancient, countries in Assyria knew, and it was their practice. You take some people and you put a few here and a few there. You spread them out. You don't move them as a group in mass because mass immigration not good. You spread them out and then they sort of assimilate into wherever you put them
Mm-hmm.
was the idea. And so they got spread out in that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was the Assyrian attack taking the north. And of course, they ended up taking at least several thousand people from the south later on. I mean, it was common that you took,
Mm.
I mean, sometimes for displacement, sometimes just taking people for slaves. Cheryl?
Um, in my version, it says, "From the soles of your feet to your head, there is no spot that is unharmed. There are only bruises, cuts, and open wounds that have not been cleansed or bandaged." And that reminds me of Jesus and his sufferings and what his body was like when
Yeah,
he took all of our sin.
yeah. I think it's that kind of imagery. It made me think of the parable of the so-called Good Samaritan, right? Well, you've got this guy that's just so injured, and that parable says something about love, but it also, in a real sense, gives a nice picture of a nation or even an individual, you or me, who Jesus came along and healed, who brought salvation. But this is their condition. Like it's he's picturing it. This is where it's poetry, it's high language, and it's giving this imagery. We're to visualize a person who we look at and we think they're barely alive. And there has been no comfort, no cleansing, no relief, no bandaging, no spraying that cold spray that makes the burns not hurt anymore, nothing. No soothing with oil. These were ancient ways of doing medical treatment. They've received no medical help. They're not stabilized. They don't have a prospect for healing. They look like they're dying. And verse 7 speaks to the land. The land is desolate. That means it's emptied out of its people. Your cities are burned down. That's why I said it was Sennacherib, is what's probably in view. That will happen in the course of Isaiah's ministry. Sennacherib will burn the cities. That's what he did. Uh, 46 of them. Foreigners devour your fields. That's what he did. Right in front of you. They couldn't do anything. They were completely helpless. That's an interesting thing. How on earth can God's people be completely helpless? But I forgot to mention earlier, if you've not read Deuteronomy 28 in a while, you should read it. Deuteronomy is a retelling of the covenant God made with his people Israel. We call it the Mosaic covenant sometimes. And in Deuteronomy 28, he spells out things that will happen in terms of blessings for obedience and then curses for disobedience. All the things they will experience are exactly what he said would happen. And they're there, including, using a foreign nation. It's right in front of them. There's nothing they can do. Desolation, like a place demolished by foreigners, verse 7. Uh, this is an interesting word. Mine says demolished. Some translations say overthrown in verse 7. This Hebrew term is used elsewhere only in terms of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is an utter desolation, and he's going to bring up Sodom and Gomorrah here shortly. He's going to say, you, Israel, you, the people of God, you, and again, you can kind of fill in whatever Christian group, you're Sodom, you're Gomorrah. He's going to call them that. And he uses that word, and I think the Jewish hearer might recognize he's using the word that he uses when God destroys Gentiles. But he's allowed that to happen to us. Daughter Zion, verse 8, Zion's a mountain, but in Jerusalem, but it gets used to refer to the city or even the idea of the whole country. Daughter Zion is abandoned. Now, God raised up Jerusalem. He made it a very special place architecturally, gave it, for its size, a lot of influence, some grandeur, especially during Solomon's reign. And it's been abandoned like a shelter in a vineyard, he says in verse 8, like a shelter in a vineyard, like a shack in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. When a city is besieged, people try to run away if they can. When Jerusalem was besieged for 4 years, from AD 66 to 70, by the Romans, they tried to escape. Now, the Romans caught them running and was under the impression they had swallowed their money, and so they were gutted. Terrible thing. But people run. The shack in the cucumber field, the little shelter in the vineyard. Often people's vineyards and their fields for growing something might have been a distance out of the city. There might have been a reason to sit down and have some shelter for a while you're out there working, or even to stay overnight if you had to. And so you made fairly inexpensive, fragile lean-tos. And this great city, this impervious city, has become as weak as one of these little shacks that blows over in a good storm. That's what's happened. And why? They don't trust God. They don't trust God. And so God said, you know what? I'm going to let you sort of take care of your own defenses for a while. If the Lord of hosts, or the Lord of armies, verse 9, had not left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom and we would resemble Gomorrah. Complete, total devastation. The discovery of the actual site of Sodom and Gomorrah is fairly recent. I think it happened in the 90s. For the longest time, there was a different location, and we're pretty sure the current location that's had some archaeological work is correct. One of the interesting finds there is a material that's mostly unknown, yet it's common in this archaeological find. The place where it was known to be found was when, during the Second World War, when we were testing nuclear weapons out in the desert, it would get so hot, it would generate a kind of glass substance. And it has I forget the special name for it, but you've got to have like extraordinary heat, far more than not just a fire. You don't get it from just raising a city. You've got to have this extraordinary heat that's just not really naturally made. And that's what they found at Sodom and Gomorrah, and they found a lot of it. So this place was totally devastated. And yet he says, if the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, that's an expression. It's more, it's not like it was just three people. If he hadn't left a few survivors, we would be like Sodom and Gomorrah. In other words, completely annihilated. This introduces remnant theology. God works through a remnant. The chosen people of God have gotten woodshed moments in history, but a remnant's been preserved. Paul picks that up and he assures us, and he really starts talking about it in Romans 9, but for the Romans 9 through 11, Paul is emphatic. He even quotes from Isaiah about remnant theology. And he is emphatic, contrary to the majority teaching of Christians today, that God will, in fact, keep all these promises, that the nation of Israel hasn't lost the benefit of the promises, but it's because of this remnant. In fact, God has always had a remnant at a different place in time. There's a prophet, he didn't write anything that we're aware of, but he was a great prophet named Elijah, who seemed to come to the idea that he was the last guy left that was faithful to God. And God said, no, I've got, thousands of people that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. God always has a remnant. And in particular, a Jewish believing remnant. There's a Jewish believing remnant today. We've referenced Arnold Fruchtenbaum's book a couple of times in here. He's a Jewish Christian. He's a believer who's a Christian. He's part of that Jewish remnant in that sense. But God has acted that way, and this introduces it. He'll build a lot on it later, but Romans 9:27 to 29 introduces this remnant idea. And Paul says, to people in the first century who don't understand why so many Jews rejected Christ, he says, you need to know that there's a remnant. And yes, God has removed the branch from the tree for the moment, but he's able and he will in due time graft them back in. So Sodom and Gomorrah. Listen to verse 10. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers, you rulers. He's going to have a lot to say in these first five chapters and later about leadership. And that matters a lot because there's also like a theology of leadership in the Bible, and it gets developed especially in a lot of the prophets. In a sense, as the leadership goes, so goes the people. That's the danger of electing bad leaders. It's why elections matter. Of course, a lot of countries don't have elections, but when we put in power evil people, and I'm not tying this to a party or a political platform, just people who, according to God's standard, are just evil people who are acting at odds with his principles, the people tend to uh, go along with them, at least to a large degree. They're very influential. And it just seems like when you read the history in the Bible, if you have a king that's bad, that did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, the people seem to be the same way. And so there's an indictment on the rulers. Jesus would deal with the leadership in the first century when he does his earthly ministry. John the Baptist kept making people mad. He eventually lost his head for dealing with the leadership. And he calls the Jewish leaders of Sodom. It's I had a note here because I looked at a commentary, and this is what he said. He said he's never heard of anybody at any time reading verses 10 through 15 to a church and saying, you know what? Maybe he's talking to us. He says, because that person's they're getting their butt fired, right? The whole congregation is going to be led of God to send them away. And the reality is there's a whole lot of churches that will even gather tomorrow. And these are the only 5 verses they really need to be thinking about. Here, he says, you rulers of Sodom, listen to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. You think the Sodomites, the Gomorrah people, that they were the worst ever. In God's people, he says you're just like them. And I'm telling you, he could look at a lot of people today in a lot of places, even people that are good church-going folks, will call them. And he might say this. This isn't seeker friendly, but it's true. And when I read about people who in our culture, more or less what they want a little sense of spirituality, but they want a perforated Bible where you can take Isaiah chapter 1, verses 10 to 15 and tear along the perforated lines and pull it out. What are all your sacrifices to me? He calls the people, and he said, why is 10 and 11 and 13, why are these verses even here? He just said, you people are awful. And now he's dealing with what their defense is going to be. In the modern language, I'd say, well, Lord, I was always going to church. I was always giving money and I prayed and I did this and I did that. These people are saying, look, we went to the temple. I was there on every feast day, every full moon. I made all the sacrifices. I made all the tithes. I did all these things. That's their defense. And God says, I detest it. Listen to him. Verse 11, what are all your sacrifices to me? Jesus said in John, when he talked to the lady at the well in John 4, that God seeks worshipers who will worship in spirit and truth. That was true essentially through the Bible. There is you can have worship that outwardly looks like worship, but it's not worship at all. That's what was happening there. And it can happen here in our time. They were making the sacrifices because the law required it. And I'm sure they would have said that to Isaiah. Well, we're just doing what the law requires. What's the problem? Why do their sacrifices, why are they not a sweet savor to the Lord, but they're garbage? I've had enough of burnt offerings and rams and the fat of well-fed cattle. I have no desire for the blood of bulls, lambs, or goats. When you come to appear before me, and that speaks of the annual feast, they had to come to the temple and appear before God at these annual feasts. There were 3 times a year when they had to come. There were 7 feasts and they appear before God. And he says, when you come to appear before me, and the Jew would think of these feasts that are spelled out in Leviticus, who requires this from you? Who requires you to come to me? He says, this trampling of my courts, the courts outside the temple, right? Outside the actual building in the middle, there's these courts. You're coming, and they say they're coming to worship. He says, you're coming. Who requires you to come and trample my courts? Because here's the deal, and Jesus talked about this in the New Testament. He said, before you go and give your offering at the temple, if you've got a beef with your brother or your fellow believer, go deal with that first, then come back. We can trample the courts. We can make what should be, in a sense, a holy convocation for worship at church on Sunday something that God detests. Just because we sing a beautiful song and make the beautiful music doesn't mean God is pleased. You say, well, what's the difference? You can do those things with a proper heart, and you can do those things with a completely unbelieving, untrusting heart, which is what these people were doing. And so stop bringing the useless offerings. He says in verse 13, your incense is detestable to me, the new moons and the Sabbaths and the calling of the solemn assemblies. I can't stand iniquity with a feast. I can't stand this festival when you guys are so steeped in sin. I hate your new moons. Can you imagine reading this to a church? I hate your song service, God says. I hate your prayer. I hated it when you read my word. I hated it when the preacher talked. We can't imagine that happening, but God can absolutely do that. He can absolutely think that. And I think there's a bunch of churches that fall under that for exactly the reason these people did. I know that's harsh, but that was reality. This is why Isaiah eventually got killed. They become a burden to me. Your worship's become a burden to me. I'm tired of putting up with them. He says, I'm tired of putting up with your worship. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I'll refuse to look at you. Them prayers ain't getting answered. Even if you offer countless prayers, I won't listen. Your hands are covered with blood. That blood is representative of their sin. He's going to deal with that later. We won't deal with that now, but as we come to our close here. But I want you to think about this. If you read even fiction, like right now, this Odyssey's been made into a movie that I will not see, but I did read the book recently and I read the Iliad. One of the things that comes out of reading the Iliad and the Odyssey is you learn a lot about their religion and worship of that culture. And the gods are very Zeus and, Apollo and Poseidon, all these people. They're very earthy. They're sinful. They're wicked. And the worship is not, which is largely ritualistic, like a lot of the Jewish worship. It's ritualistic. You can do that with or without a certain attitude. But the way they viewed it is you need to manipulate the gods into your favor. And you can do that by offering prayers and all kinds of sacrifices and oblations, the pouring out of the grain and the meat and the meal or the wine offerings. And you manipulate these gods to give you victory, right? That's what you do. That was the pagan way of thinking. And that was what the Jews were doing. It's not that the rituals are wrong in themselves. God prescribed the rituals. But you can do the rituals from a position of faith and trust or from a position of manipulation. When we make idols, which the pagans did out of wood and stone, they make them in their with their own hands. He's going to talk about that a little later here. They fashion them with their own fingers because you've become your own God. You shape your idol into what you want it to be, and you reflect that image in your own life. We talked about that in our worldview series. So these people of God are treating the rituals of that they're supposed to do as part of their worship the way the pagans treated them. They're just ways that you manipulate God. I don't know why God makes us come worship at the temple and do it this way or that way, but if that's what it takes to, to get him to give us special favor, we'll do it, right? There's no faith in God. It's just manipulation. Now, fast forward, and this is where I'll close. Has that come into the church? I mean, is there not? I mean, I see it all the time on the internet, and I've had some background in this kind of church thinking. We call it name it and claim it. You believe this and that, and you have enough faith when I mean, this one guy who keeps just telling you how you can get all this money, and God's got to give you the money. These are the things you do, very mechanistic things, and they may involve prayer and they may involve singing a song, but these are the mechanics you go through, and God has to give you whatever you want, in particular money, right? Wealth. Uh, that's just paganism. That's all it is, dressed over as some form of Christianity. This kind of worship can easily come in to a church setting, and it's telling if the only thing we ever pray for is for God to give us something. I think it's telling. Well, let's stop there, and I'll hang around if you've got some questions or comments. But this is some pretty heavy stuff. I really encourage you to try to at least read through chapter two. That'll be our goal next week to get at least into chapter two, because he's going to go from talking about today to talking about tomorrow to talking about the last days, the coming millennial kingdom. So we've got a broad swath of theology that we're going to see here in just a very small space. Judd?
Yeah, I'll just throw out
Yeah.
a footnote that may or may not be interesting, but did you know that in both Italy and Greece, there are still some people that worship those old, that old pantheon of gods? And it's actually in Greece, they just recognized it as a minority religion. And I just think, who would want to go back to that garbage? I think that's why Christianity swept Europe and North Africa so quickly, is because when you're exposed to the real thing, you see, the fake thing as, ridiculous. And it is. If you study that religion and if you study how people practiced it, it's so bizarre, and all the superstition. Like if you know any old Italian, we're from the Northeast, from the New York City area, so, and Boca Raton too. There's a lot of these old Italians, and they're just so superstitious about everything. It's like exhausting.
Yeah. Well, we tend to forget today that this was real religion. This is what Christianity is birthed in the middle of that. And I mentioned Odyssey and Iliad earlier, but read Alexander, read the history of Alexander the Great. We know a whole lot about him, and you'll learn a lot about his worship. And it is manipulating the gods to his favor. And of course, that makes you very superstitious, because every time something doesn't go well, you got to think, well, maybe I should have given an extra dozen bulls or whatever. That's how they think. Cheryl?
Was the term that you were looking for before trinitite or Alamo Gordo glass, which
Yes.
is it's the
Yes.
greenish glass-like material. It melts the sand and debris, and when it crystallizes, that's what it becomes.
Right. But it's super high temperature, and they found it out where they did the testing. Of course, like Los Alamos, uh, and they found it in these layers. You can read about this, like it's a real thing, and this is recent stuff. And it's fascinating how the guy that kind of really just from looking at the scripture said, the place where we think Sodom and Gomorrah is that doesn't match the Bible. I think it's going to be over here. And they went and started digging, and there it was. And um, but it speaks of a complete annihilation, nothing left. And the Jews had to think God would never do that to us. And so hearing those words, I think had to put some fear into them.